rightly said in your introduction, this was obviously a global phenomenon. And the interesting thing about it, I would say there are two things, two elements in this COVID craze, this COVID mystique that has taken over political and social life during at least 2 years, from, mind you, from January, February 2020 till the moment when Vladimir Putin obviously cured COVID when he invaded Ukraine. Was that very day COVID was over miraculously. But okay, so during those 2 years, we witnessed effectively two things. The first is that all societal checks and balances, not merely formal checks and balances in terms of fundamental rights, freedom rights, an independent judiciary, parliamentary restrictions on what the executive branch may or may not do. All these formal checks and balances of a democracy vanished overnight. So the state operated as one block, imposing these restrictions which indeed have not been imposed since the dawn of time, essentially. But also, not just these formal checks and balances, but also the informal, the material checks and balances of a free society stopped functioning. Journalists were of one opinion only. They silenced every critical voice. Academic institutions, corporations, businesses, the entire fabric of society in the way that I used to understand it as a diverse series of different players with their separate interests that were sometimes aligning, sometimes conflicting, and that resulted in this quasi-chaotic manner through an invisible hand, as it were, in a free society where more or less rational conclusions were drawn through all these players that had their thing to bring to the table. This vanished. From February/March 2020 onwards, there was one narrative that was pushed across the board. Lockdowns work to limit the spread of disease, such as that. Mortality rates are not to be looked at at a statistical level because we are dealing with something that is so beyond anything rational and anything we've ever seen before that we're going to give Ebola virus status internationally to this virus, which means that, you know, all comparisons are off. You were not allowed to compare it to the flu. You were not allowed to say, look, the mortality rates are actually quite similar to what we've seen in the previous years, and so on and so forth. You were not allowed, thirdly, to question the vaccine or the efficiency of the vaccines or the very technology behind it, the mRNA technology, as a means to effectively vaccinate people against viruses. You know, these are all serious questions that up until January, February 2020, people were allowed to ask. And all of a sudden, the entire fabric of society, all institutions, overnight, they started pushing the same narrative. And that was extremely frightening to me, especially because this happened internationally. Not just in the Netherlands, but also here in Britain, in France, in the United States. There were a couple of governors here and there. In Sweden, you know, there were some people who were asking questions. There were some outliers here and there, but they were very, very marginal. And this was the case across mainstream media, as I said, academics, big corporations, the government institutions. They all went along with this story. And the second. So this was, for me, it was really, really a very, very shocking thing to realize. There was absolutely nothing you could do. Big tech, the formerly free internet stopped being free. I'm very aware that we're having this conversation right now, and it's possible that it's going to be taken down from YouTube, from Facebook, that the big tech platforms are going to say, no, you're not allowed to talk about it in such a way. So this so it was not just the realization that all quasi-rational or countervailing procedures that used to exist stopped existing, but also that these irrational and even dictatorial, tyrannical policies that were implemented internationally, globally. So the two conclusions that I drew from the COVID period were, first, okay, our free democratic society is effectively, it's maybe not dead, but it exists only at the mercy of the government. If the deep state behind the government, or whatever you want to call it, if they allow a free debate on a particular subject, then we'll have the free debate. But if they don't, everybody stands in line. Secondly, this is an international phenomenon. So we may believe that we live in sovereign nation states where we have parliaments, where they have discussions about things, and then the parliament decides A and another parliament decides B, so you have a concert of nations, that kind of thing. That's history. That's not the way the world apparently works, because this was implemented on the very same day, March 16, 2020, Britain, the Netherlands, Italy, France, they all went in lockdown. It's impossible, it's inconceivable that this was a sort of spontaneous decision. And thirdly, and perhaps even most frighteningly, I haven't mentioned it yet, but the sheer tyrannical nature and heartlessness and inhumane nature of the policies. We are being governed by people that are irrational, which is obvious. There was from April, May 2020 onwards, there was absolutely no discussion anymore. Professor Ioannidis, major studies, all confirmed by so many other scientists, of the mortality of COVID, which was comparable to the flu. There's no serious discussion about it. Secondly, lockdowns, they don't work to limit the spreading of diseases. There was, from May, June onwards, it was, the numbers were clear, the statistics were there. It was absolutely unarguable that it was working. Now, so on and so forth. So the irrationality of the decisions being taken, the international nature of these policies, and thirdly, the ability, apparently, of our institutions of authority, the decision makers, those in power, to implement policies that harm people to the extent that it has left elderly people to die alone. It has caused enormous numbers of depression amongst the youth. It has destroyed businesses on a scale that is just, we're still suffering from it, the consequences. These three realizations made me change my life, the course of my political party. It has changed my understanding of the world fundamentally, and I found myself to be the only elected politician in the Western world, as maybe even in the world, but I'm not that familiar with people in India, for example. There may be other, but I was literally the only one in Europe, in the EU, who opposed not merely, let's say, whether or not we should have a curfew that starts at 9 or 10 o'clock, or whether or not we should have social distancing of 90 centimeters or 1 meter 50, or whether or not we should mandate the vaccines or merely make them freely available if you choose so. No, but I fundamentally attacked the very idea that governments may impose lockdowns in the first place. This to me is just beyond the license of governments, beyond the rights that governments have. And I attacked the mortality rates. I criticized the idea that it's equal to Ebola virus and so on. And I was literally the only one. So I felt, and I had huge, obviously a huge number of attacks. My party was the largest party in the polls. We had just topped the polls. We had won the Senate elections. I was on track to become a member of the Dutch government. I was, we were having drinks with former ministers. The former leader of the currently governing party had dinner with me, and he ordered a nice bottle of French white Burgundy. And he said, you can have any position you want. That was the energy I was in. And all of a sudden, I found myself to be the number one enemy of the state, the number one outcast in politics. And I felt I had to write this book to tell my story, because I think I may have been the only one to stand up, but I'm absolutely confident that a lot of people across the world have felt the same things that I have felt, have thought the same thoughts that I have felt. And this story tells the story of how this cartel behind the scenes is able effectively to push people into acquiescing in the dominant narrative. People are very afraid to speak out because they don't want to lose their job. They don't want to lose their friends. They don't want to become an outcast. They don't want to lose access to all the benefits that you get when you are a nice, jolly old part of the game, part of the party, part of the crew. So I feel this book that's now coming out, it may touch a nerve that people have. They sort of have a sense. I think a lot of people have a sense that our liberties, our freedoms, are being taken away. But where exactly is it coming from? Right? There's a sort of a very vague sense of something is off here. Something isn't right. But where is it coming from? How is it working? And as far as I know, I'm the only one who was in a position of power within the ranks of the system, speaking out, breaking out, and everything that followed from the attacks in the media to all the classical names that they drop. You're a racist, you're a fascist, you're a misogynist, you're a anti-Semite. Obviously, you are a what have you not. Anti-gay activist, you're anti-democratic, you're a denier, you're a COVID denier, you're a climate denier, they have all these words that they just throw at you and repeat in the press endlessly. And obviously you're a Russian spy, that is a sure thing you're always going to get. But it tells this story, and I think it's still all these mechanisms, even though COVID may be sort of over or feel like it's over, maybe it's coming back, but nobody really knows. But it's essentially the same thing with the Ukraine situation. It's the same thing with the EU, the euro currency, CBDC that's coming for us, immigration, climate change. They have a way, and with they I mean the global international deep state, those who shape the dominant agenda. They have a very effective way to create the illusion of consensus. They manufacture consent, to quote the famous Noam Chomsky, who wrote a book about this. They manufacture consent, and it is our job, and that's how I would like to make the bridge to John sitting here. It's our job to create a platform that counters this dominant narrative. We have to create a counter narrative. And that is why during COVID, as I was fighting my fight in the Netherlands, and I wrote the book, and it was just within the Netherlands, it's a very vivid debate, and I think we are amongst the nation, and I do pride myself a little bit on having contributed to that a little bit, with the lowest number of support for the lockdowns, the lowest number of compliance with the lockdowns, and the lowest number of vaccination status. So the highest number of people that were sort of doubting, like, why are we doing this? What? So, and I think that's very important. So by creating a counter-narrative, you can actually change the general mood in the country. And I'm not saying that I was the only one to do that. Obviously, there were other people, great people in the Netherlands and elsewhere, Bobby Kennedy, international, other people. But this just does create a difference. And I felt, coming out of the COVID period, that we needed to sort of scale up and bring the openness of the debate in the Netherlands. And we have obviously a long tradition of publishing Montesquieu and Voltaire and Enlightenment books. And the Netherlands is sort of it's a country where sometimes new things come up. We had to create a platform to push this to an international level. And that's when I reached out to John. John has been an old friend and someone I've been admiring for many, many years. I consider him, he's the intellectual mastermind behind Brexit. He has written the book on sovereignty, which is called The Tainted Source, and everybody should read that. He's written great works on international law. And I really felt that someone like him, or actually just him, he should do this. We should do this together. And that's why it's also exciting to be in podcasts together and to reach out. And I hope if people see this and if they listen to this, they might want to reach out to us, and perhaps we can organize a conference soon. And it would be wonderful if you would be there. We really need to create this because and that's the final point I'll make, and then I'll shut up and you can say whatever you want. But the conservatards, as I call them, the mainstream conservative movement, or the established right, the mainstream right, has really betrayed us. It's clear now that this is the place where we both come from. We come from a sort of mainstream conservative right, and I know you come from a different place, and that's why it's so exciting that people like us are now sort of having a conversation. We're like, oh, hey, we agree on this, we agree on that. That's very interesting. But the mainstream right has really shown its uselessness when it comes to defending the actual principles that we're fighting for. So what we need to do is create something new, create a new movement. And the term that I've sort of come up with is the Global Anti-Globalist Alliance. That's that's the line along which I'm thinking, and that includes obviously the defense of sovereignty, but also of national currency. Therefore, it's an opposition against CBDC, now, and so on and so forth. So these are just the grand contours of where I am and how all of this came about.